there are two scenarios. Trump is elected and does what he says, and Trump is elected and doesn't do what he says. And I think the market so far has tended to tack towards its campaign rhetoric, it doesn't translate. But we are starting to see, particularly with some of the appointments, a signal that, okay, it may not be 60%, but President-elect Trump has become a lot more focused on tariffs. I mean, it's been a recurring theme in a way that it wasn't 8 years ago. And I think that we are going to see significant tariffs. Now, in actual fact, the tariffs against China, though obviously very significant, those are what we call selective tariffs. It's against just one country. The thing about selective tariffs is you get round them over time. They decay over time in terms of their effectiveness. What is a lot more troubling is the coincident threat of a universal tariff, 10 or 20% on everything, because you can't get round a universal tariff except by smuggling, which, to be fair, the Americans were very good at in the 1770s when they were smuggling against legitimate tariffs from His Majesty's government. But today, you can't do that. And so the real risk here, I think, is a combination of aggressive tariffs on China and a universal tariff. That would be extraordinarily disruptive.
How inflationary, and I know it's a tough one to glean at this point because we haven't got a clear indication of A, the appointments, and B, how this is going to materialise exactly, but how potentially inflationary could both Trump's tax and tariff policy be?
Well, the tariffs themselves are a sales tax which American consumers will pay. And that is very clear. They paid in 2018. They'll pay this time. Now, by American consumer, I mean consumers of imported goods. So in some cases, that's American companies, but the cost is borne within the American economy. Now, there is a potential risk here that, particularly with the universal tariff, you may end up with something which is more inflationary than the economic models suggest. Because if I say to you, OK, America's going to put in place, let's say, a 10% tariff, a lot of people think, well, that means the price of an imported good in a store will rise by 10%.
Not necessarily.
But not necessarily. It should rise by about 4%. Because the tariff is applied at the dockside, and after that, the consumer's got to pay for the retailer, for the wholesale, for the transport costs. Those are not subject to tariff. But there is a risk here of another round of profit-led inflation, where because everyone assumes the price will rise by 10%, retailers can get away with expanding profit margin and raising prices by 10%. So we might actually get a second wave of inflation. The initial tariff being passed through to the consumer, but then because consumers feel that it's fair that prices go up by 10%, you actually get an increase in margin on top.
Is that second wave of inflation going to tip the global economy into a recession?
That is a lot more tricky to judge because it depends on the response elsewhere. It certainly does a lot of damage in the United States because this is going to undermine consumer spending power in the United States. And the middle-income consumer has a cushion. They've got more savings. So that gives you a certain amount of security, but it certainly increases the risks in the States. Elsewhere in the world, it depends on how countries are responding, retaliatory tariffs. I'm going to remember, if the US is applying a universal tariff, it's US versus the rest of the world.
Yeah.
But in terms of retaliation, Europe is only retaliating against the States. It's not retaliating against the UK or against China. So the impact here is unbalanced in that sense.
There have been reports that one of the first things that Trump is going to do after taking office is begin deportations, right? Build up the wall as well. The deportations, right? What kind of, and again, it depends on how fast and how serious and how aggressive he is, right? Could potentially have massive impacts on the U.S. labor market as wages and inflation.
So there's two issues around deportations. The first is how do you pay for this?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, this is not a small thing to be doing. And it would almost certainly increase the fiscal deficit to engage in mass deportations because you've got to throw resources at this. So that of itself creates questions about inflation and where you're going with fiscal policy. The thing about migration, whether it's legal or illegal migration, is that migrants tend to go to economies where there are job opportunities.
Yes.
You don't go to an economy where there's unemployment. And secondly, they tend to cluster where there are bottlenecks in the labour supply. So the issue here is that you are potentially going to recreate bottlenecks if you are removing very large numbers of workers. because we're talking about bottlenecks here, that means that even if you say, well, we're only going after illegal migrants, okay, that's absolutely fine, but that will also affect citizens' ability to work. Because if you create a bottleneck, it's, well, we can't build this house because we don't have the bricklayers, that puts the citizen who's an electrician out of work. And so you get different complications coming through. If this is pursued in a very aggressive way, it would be, I think, quite disruptive to the labour market in creating these shortages. It's worthwhile bearing in mind that under Biden, under Obama, and under Trump's first term, we had deportations. But it's the scale this time, I think, which presents the challenge to a labour market that is already relatively tight.
So